Hello, welcome back to ZzZscience. Tonight we're going to talk about something that has been standing quietly for a very long time. Not moving, not changing, at least not in any way that a human lifetime would notice. Just sitting there, at the edge of the desert, where the green of the Nile Valley ends and the pale stone of the plateau begins. They have been there through everything, through empires rising and falling, through languages being born and forgotten, through every kind of human catastrophe and every kind of human celebration. And they are still there tonight, right now, while you are lying in the dark listening to this. There is something about that, something that is hard to name. Most things we encounter in daily life have an obvious beginning and end. A building goes up, and eventually it comes down. A city is founded, and eventually it changes into something unrecognizable. Even mountains, over geological time, erode and shift. But the Great Pyramid of Giza has been standing for roughly 4,500 years, and it is still, more or less, what it was when it was finished. The top is gone now, a little. The outer casing of smooth white limestone was stripped away long ago, used for other buildings in Cairo. So what we see today is the stepped, rough-hewn core. But the shape is unmistakable. The presence is unmistakable. And the size is still almost impossible to absorb. When people first encounter the pyramids in person, the thing they most often mention is that photographs don't prepare you for them. This is interesting, because we have more photographs of the pyramids than almost any other structure on Earth. They have been photographed from every angle, in every season, in every kind of light. There are drone images and satellite images, and images taken from the top by people who really shouldn't have climbed up there. You would think that by the time you arrived at Giza, you would already know exactly what to expect. But photographs, it seems, don't carry the thing that makes the pyramids what they are. Part of it is simply scale. The Great Pyramid, built for the pharaoh Khufu, stands at about 138 meters today, having lost some height from the erosion of its summit over millennia. When it was first completed, it was around 146 meters. For a very long time, it was the tallest structure ever built by human hands. For most of recorded human history, in fact. It held that distinction for roughly 3,800 years, until medieval cathedrals in Europe began to surpass it. And even knowing that number, even knowing that it is 138 meters, doesn't quite do the trick. You can picture a 138-meter building. You have a rough sense of what that means. But when you are standing at the base and you look up, the mind still refuses to accept it. The base of the Great Pyramid covers about 53,000 square meters. You could fit the footprint of several large city blocks inside it. The stones used in its construction number somewhere around 2.3 million, weighing between 2 and 15 tons each, with some of the granite blocks used in the interior chambers weighing as much as 80 tons. The total mass of the structure has been estimated at around 6 million tons. These are the kinds of numbers that feel more like a geological formation than a building. And yet, someone built it. Specific people, with specific tools, working during a specific period in a specific place, following plans that other specific people had drawn up. It was not an accident. It was not a natural formation. It was a decision, executed with a precision that still, after all the study we have put into it, prompts genuine astonishment. The silence around the pyramids helps too. When you are there early in the morning, before the crowds arrive, before the vendors set up along the pathways, there is a quality of stillness that is hard to find elsewhere. The plateau sits above the city. Cairo is enormous and loud in the way that very large, very alive cities tend to be. But up on the plateau, especially at certain angles and certain times of day, you can look out across the stone and the sand and feel something that isn't quite solitude, because you are aware that you are standing somewhere intensely historical, intensely populated by memory. It is more like being in the presence of something that doesn't need to speak because it has already said everything it is going to say. Simple shapes hold a particular kind of power. This is worth thinking about for a moment, because it gets at something important about why the pyramids keep their hold on us. A pyramid is not a complicated form. It is four triangular faces rising from a square base to a single point. Children can draw it. It appears in corporate logos and on currency, and in the geometry problems of primary school students around the world. It is as basic as a shape gets, next to a circle or a cube. And yet, realized at this scale, in stone, in the middle of a desert, it becomes something entirely different from what it is when you sketch it on a piece of paper. There is a theory in architecture and design that simple forms, when scaled up enormously, acquire a kind of sublimity that complex forms cannot match. The complexity of a Gothic cathedral, with its carved figures and its stained glass and its ribbed vaulting, is spectacular in a way that engages the eye constantly, pulling attention from detail to detail. But a pyramid gives you almost nothing to focus on. There is no ornamentation, there are no windows, no columns, no decorative frieze running around the base. There is just the slope, just the angle, just the line of stone rising steadily toward the sky. And because there is so little to look at in the usual sense, the mind is forced to simply receive the thing as a whole. You can't break it down into components. You can't look at the interesting bit over there. There is only the pyramid and the sky behind it, and the strange feeling of standing before something that is simultaneously very simple and completely overwhelming. Aristotle said that beauty arises from magnitude and order. He didn't have the pyramids specifically in mind, or maybe he did, since they were already ancient by his time. But the formulation fits. The Great Pyramid has magnitude beyond almost anything built by human hands. And it has order of the most fundamental kind. Those two things together produce something that bypasses the ordinary machinery of aesthetic appreciation and goes somewhere deeper. We don't entirely know what that somewhere is. That's part of what we're here to explore tonight. Let's talk about what we actually know about how the pyramids were built, because this is a subject where a great deal has been learned over the past century of serious archaeological work, and where the actual facts are, if anything, more impressive than the various myths that have sometimes surrounded them. The pyramids at Giza were built during a period known as the Old Kingdom of Ancient Egypt, specifically during the 4th dynasty. The Great Pyramid, the largest of the three main pyramids at the Giza Plateau, was built for Pharaoh Khufu and is dated to roughly 2560 BCE. The second pyramid was built for his son Khafre, and the third, significantly smaller one, for Menkaure, Khafre's son. The famous Sphinx, carved from a single outcrop of limestone bedrock, is associated with Khafre and was likely created during his reign. The Old Kingdom was a period of remarkable organizational sophistication in Egyptian society. The state had developed complex administrative structures, methods for recording and distributing resources, and the capacity to mobilize large numbers of workers over extended periods. The pyramids were not built by slaves, as was commonly believed for many centuries. This is one of those misconceptions that has been thoroughly refuted by archaeological evidence, and that still stubbornly persists in popular culture. The workers who built the pyramids were Egyptian state employees, organized into crews with names, provided with food and medical care, and buried with some honor when they died. We know this Because their village has been found south of the Pyramid Plateau at Giza, and it has been extensively excavated. The workers' village, often called Hayt el Garab, or sometimes just the lost city of the pyramid builders, was discovered and excavated by archaeologist Mark Lehner beginning in the 1980s and continuing into the 2000s. What the excavations revealed was a large, organized settlement capable of housing somewhere between 10,000 and perhaps 20,000 people at peak periods. There were bakeries and breweries producing food and drink at industrial scale. There were livestock pens. There were administrative buildings. There were the graves of workers, many of whom showed signs of healed fractures, which tells us something interesting. They survived injuries, which means there was medical care, which means the state valued these workers enough to treat them when they were hurt. The workers were organized into teams, and those teams had names. We know some of them. One team working on the Great Pyramid called themselves Friends of Khufu. Another, recorded in graffiti inside the pyramid's relieving chambers, was called The Gang, How Powerful is the White Crown of Khnum Khufu. These are not the inscriptions of slaves. They are the inscriptions of people who felt a kind of pride in what they were building, who identified themselves in relation to their work. The logistics of actually building the Great Pyramid are staggering, and the process is still not fully understood in every detail. But the broad outline is reasonably clear. Stone was quarried, largely from a quarry just south of the pyramid site itself, which supplied most of the limestone used in the pyramid's core. Higher quality white limestone for the outer casing came from quarries across the Nile at Tura. Granite for the interior chambers came from Aswan, nearly 900 kilometers to the south. Moving the stone was accomplished primarily by boat along the Nile and through purpose-built canals, and then overland on wooden sledges pulled by teams of workers. There is actual physical evidence for this. Traces of the harbour and canal system have been found at Giza. A papyrus discovered at the site of Wadi el Jaf, on the Red Sea coast, is the diary of a man named Merah, who was a middle manager of some kind, overseeing the transport of limestone from Tura to the Giza Plateau. It is the oldest papyrus ever found, and it describes in matter-of-fact detail the logistics of moving building materials. Stone was delivered, stone was unloaded. The work went on, day after day. How the stones were lifted once they arrived at the pyramid is the part we are least certain about. Various ramp systems have been proposed. Some researchers favor a straight ramp that ran from a quarry or delivery point up one face of the pyramid, growing taller as the pyramid grew. Others favor a spiral ramp that wound around the outside of the pyramid as it was built. Each hypothesis has problems. A straight ramp long enough to reach the upper levels of the pyramid would have required more material to build than the pyramid itself. A spiral ramp would have obscured the corners needed to measure the pyramid's geometry accurately. Some researchers have proposed internal ramps. The honest answer is that we don't know for certain, and we may never know, because ramps would have been temporary structures that were removed when the work was finished, leaving little trace. What we do know is that the precision achieved is remarkable by any standard. The base of the Great Pyramid is nearly perfectly level. The deviation from true level across the entire base is less than 2 centimeters. The sides of the base are oriented to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of better than 1/10 of a degree. The dimensions of the base are almost perfectly equal, with a difference of only about 20 centimeters between the longest and shortest sides. For a structure this size, built with the tools available at the time, this precision is extraordinary. It required careful surveying, skilled workforce management, and a degree of planning and execution that speaks to a genuinely sophisticated civilization. It is worth dwelling on this precision, because it is one of the things that sometimes prompts speculation in the direction of the fantastical. The argument goes, this is so precise, how could ancient Egyptians have done it? And implicit in that question sometimes is an assumption that ancient people were not capable of this level of sophistication. This assumption is wrong, and it is worth being clear about that. The ancient Egyptians were fully modern humans, with fully modern brains, living in a complex and highly organized society. They had mathematics, astronomy, engineering knowledge, and a bureaucratic apparatus capable of coordinating large-scale projects. The precision of the pyramids is evidence of their capability, not evidence of outside help. There is something a little unfortunate about the impulse to attribute the achievements of ancient people to beings from elsewhere, or to lost civilizations with advanced technology that has left no other trace. It doesn't give ancient humans the credit they deserve. What the pyramids actually tell us about the Egyptians who built them is more interesting and more moving than any alternative explanation. They tell us about human capacity, human organization, human ambition, and human persistence. That is the real story, and it is extraordinary. But let's come back to a question that the facts don't entirely settle. Not how, but why. The pyramids were tombs. This is the basic answer. They were built as burial monuments for pharaohs, meant to protect the body and funerary goods, and to serve as a focus for the mortuary cult that would continue to honor the dead pharaoh and secure his journey into the afterlife. The pyramid form was connected to religious symbolism in various ways. One interpretation is that the pyramid's sloping sides represent the rays of the sun descending to earth, a ramp for the pharaoh's soul to ascend to the heavens. Another connects the form to the primordial mound of creation, the first piece of land to rise from the waters at the beginning of the world, according to Egyptian cosmological belief. The theological framework that made the pyramid meaningful is complex, and our understanding of it is necessarily incomplete, because we are working from texts and images that were produced by a very different culture across a very large span of time. Egyptian religious thought was not a fixed system. It evolved and changed over thousands of years. The beliefs of the Old Kingdom, when the pyramids were built, are not identical to the beliefs recorded in later texts. Scholars work carefully and tentatively with this material, and there is genuine debate about what the pyramid form meant to the people who built it. What seems clear is that the pyramid was not just a tomb in the way we might use that word today. It was a cosmic machine of some kind, a mechanism for ensuring the pharaoh's continuation after death, his transformation and his journey through the afterlife, and his eventual arrival among the gods. The interior of the Great Pyramid is surprisingly spare compared to what you might expect. There are 3 chambers, connected by passages of carefully cut stone. The king's chamber is lined with red granite and contains a granite sarcophagus. The queen's chamber is somewhat smaller. The so-called subterranean chamber is carved into the bedrock below the pyramid. The function of the various chambers is not entirely certain. The tomb robbers who entered the pyramid in antiquity removed the pharaoh's body and everything of value long before modern archaeologists arrived. So what remains is the stone architecture, without the context that the original contents might have provided. There are passages in the pyramid that have been called air shafts, running from the king's chamber and the queen's chamber toward the exterior of the pyramid. Whether these were actually for ventilation, or whether they served a symbolic or religious purpose, perhaps aligned with specific stars, as some researchers have proposed, is another open question. The shafts from the king's chamber point roughly toward Orion's belt and toward Thuban, the pole star at the time the pyramid was built. Whether this was intentional, and if so, what it meant, is a subject of ongoing discussion. I want to slow down here for a moment, because this is one of those places where the honest acknowledgement of uncertainty is more interesting than a confident answer. The question of what the pyramids meant to the people who built them is genuinely hard. We have religious texts from ancient Egypt, including the pyramid texts, which are inscriptions found in later Old Kingdom pyramids, and which deal with the afterlife and the pharaoh's journey. These give us some window into the belief system. But the Great Pyramid itself has no inscriptions on its walls. It is silent in that sense. It gives us architecture and geometry and material, but no written explanation of its own meaning. This silence is part of what makes the pyramids so enduring as objects of fascination. They exist without annotating themselves. They don't come with a caption. And so every generation that encounters them brings its own questions and its own interpretive frameworks. And the pyramids absorb all of it without confirming or denying any of it. They are patient in a way that only stone across 4,000 years can be patient. Time is a strange thing when you stand at the base of the Great Pyramid. We talk about 4,500 years as a number, but numbers don't carry the weight of time. They hold it in the same way that a word holds a feeling, accurately in structure, but without the actual substance. When you stand there and you try to really feel the span of time that the pyramid has been standing, the mind skips. It can't quite do the calculation in a way that lands. 4,500 years ago, there were no Greeks. There was no Rome. The Trojan War, which we think of as ancient, was still 1,000 years in the future. The founding of what we call Western civilization, measured from classical Greece, was still 2,000 years away. When the Great Pyramid was built, it was already old when Cleopatra was alive. The amount of time between Cleopatra and us today is less than the amount of time between Cleopatra and the builders of the pyramid. That fact alone has a quietly dizzying quality. Cleopatra lived in a world where the pyramids were already antique, where tourists visited them as Greek and Roman visitors did, and carved their names in the stone, and wrote about their impressions in ways that have survived into our time. Where priests still had something to say about the religious meaning of the old monuments, but where even they were working with knowledge that had passed through centuries of reinterpretation and partial loss. The pyramids were ancient to the ancient world, and they are still here. There is something about the persistence of the pyramids that touches a nerve in human psychology, and it is worth thinking about what that nerve is. We are creatures who are acutely aware of our own transience. This awareness runs through almost everything we do. We build things to last. We write things down to be remembered. We have children partly to continue something of ourselves past our own deaths. We name streets and buildings and dedicate libraries and carve names in stone, all in some effort to resist the erasure that time brings. It never fully works. Everything, eventually, is forgotten or transformed beyond recognition. But the pyramids have lasted. They haven't lasted unchanged, and in some periods of Egyptian history after the Old Kingdom, they were quarried for building material, and the casing stones are gone, and the bodies and goods they were built to protect have long since disappeared. But the basic form has persisted. The presence has persisted. And when we look at that persistence, we feel something that is partly wonder and partly a strange kind of comfort. If something that old is still standing, then perhaps permanence is possible. Perhaps not everything disappears entirely. Perhaps there is some form of duration that exceeds the ordinary limits. This is not a logical thought, exactly. It doesn't hold up to rigorous examination. The pyramids will also eventually be gone. Not in any human lifetime, not in 10 human lifetimes. But in geological terms, they are temporary, as everything is. But in experiential terms, which are the terms we actually live in, the pyramids feel permanent in a way that almost nothing else does. And that feeling matters, even if it is technically speaking an illusion. There is also something specific to our current moment in history that makes the pyramids particularly compelling. We live in a world of extraordinary change. The pace at which things shift, the speed at which new things appear and old things are replaced, has accelerated dramatically in the past century and has continued accelerating. The physical landscape of cities changes faster than it used to. Technologies become obsolete within a decade. Formats of communication and culture and entertainment rise and fall with a speed that can feel destabilizing. In this context, something that has been standing in the same place, in essentially the same form, for 4,500 years, offers a quality of fixity that is genuinely rare. Standing before the Great Pyramid, you are standing before something that was there before almost everything you know. And that will likely be there after almost everything you know has changed beyond recognition. That is a thought that can be unsettling if you approach it from one angle, and deeply calming if you approach it from another. We'll continue exploring that idea as we go, because it is one of the threads that runs through everything we're talking about tonight. The pyramids are not just a historical subject, they are a psychological subject. They are a subject about how humans relate to time and scale and mystery and the very old question of what lasts. The plateau at Giza is not only the home of the three main pyramids. There are smaller, subsidiary pyramids associated with queens and other royal family members. There are mastabas, flat-topped rectangular tombs that were the standard burial form for nobles and officials of the Old Kingdom, spread across the plateau around the larger pyramids. There is the Sphinx. There are temples, or rather the remains of temples, because much of the stone has gone into later construction. There is a whole complex of structures that archaeologists have been carefully mapping and studying for well over a century. The Sphinx is its own kind of mystery. It is the largest monolithic statue in the world, carved from a single outcrop of limestone, its body the body of a lion, and its face, probably, the face of Khafra, though there is some debate even about this. It faces east toward the rising sun. Its nose is gone, damaged at some point in history, probably sometime in the medieval period, though the claim that Napoleon's soldiers shot it off with cannonballs is almost certainly not accurate. The Sphinx has been buried in sand up to its neck for much of its history, as the desert constantly reclaims whatever doesn't resist it. The Sphinx has its own set of ongoing questions. The pattern of erosion on its body is one of them. Most Egyptologists attribute the erosion to wind and sand, but a small number of researchers, primarily a geologist named Robert Schoch, have argued that some of the erosion patterns are consistent with water erosion, which would imply that the Sphinx is older than mainstream archaeology places it, old enough to have been exposed to significant rainfall in a wetter period of North African climate history. The vast majority of Egyptologists reject this interpretation, finding it incompatible with the total absence of any evidence for a pre-dynastic civilization capable of building something like the Sphinx. But the debate continues in a minor key, and it is one of those corners of Egyptology where the uncertainty is real, even if the fringe conclusions being drawn from it are not well supported. The thing about the Sphinx standing before it is that the face looks out at you with an expression that has been read 1,000 different ways. Serene, imperious, mysterious, sad. The features have been worn by time and by the occasional violent intervention of human beings. And what remains is an ambiguous face. A face that does not clearly broadcast its intention. This ambiguity is part of what makes it endlessly photographed and endlessly described. We keep trying to read what it is expressing, and it keeps declining to tell us clearly. This is a pattern that will recur as we explore these structures. The sense that they are withholding something, or that there is a quality in them that exceeds our ability to fully decode. Whether that excess is a property of the structures themselves or a property of the human minds encountering them is a question worth sitting with. It may be both. There is a quality to the light at Giza that is worth mentioning, because it is part of what people experience when they visit. The plateau is at the edge of the desert. The air is dry. The sun, when it is up, is intense in a way that the latitudes of most northern and western visitors are not accustomed to. The stone of the pyramids, which is a pale buff color rather than the white of the original casing limestone, absorbs the heat during the day and releases it slowly. At sunrise and sunset, the pyramids catch the light in a way that changes their color, pulling out warm oranges and deep golds, and the shadows on the stepped surfaces move in a way that makes the structure seem, for a moment, almost dynamic. At night, the plateau has a different quality. The city of Cairo glows on the horizon. The sky, even through the light pollution of one of the world's largest cities, shows stars. The pyramids lose their detail in the dark and become pure shape, pure mass, pure presence. The dark angles against a lighter sky. And in that simplification, they become perhaps even more powerful than they are in daylight, when you can see the individual stones and the rough texture of the exposed core. People who have stood on the Giza plateau at night often describe a feeling that is something like standing outside of time. This is not a mystical claim, and I don't want to dress it up as one. It is a description of an experience that many people report, and that seems to arise from the specific combination of circumstances. The age of the structures, the scale of them, the emptiness of the desert around them, the dark sky, the silence. These things together produce in many people a quality of consciousness that is different from ordinary waking attention. Something quieter, something more open. The pyramids have been attracting this kind of reflection from visitors since the earliest recorded visits, which began with Egyptian visitors themselves during the Middle and New Kingdom periods, when the Old Kingdom structures were already being treated as ancient monuments worthy of reverence. Greek visitors in the classical period were similarly struck. Herodotus, the Greek historian, visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE and wrote about the pyramids in his Histories. His account is not entirely accurate, and some of what he recorded seems to have been what local guides told him, which may have been embellished for tourist purposes even then. But what comes through is a sense of genuine wonder, a traveler encountering something that exceeded his expectations and that he struggled to convey in words. That struggle to convey the pyramids in words has been going on for a very long time. It is, in some ways, still going on tonight. The question of how the pyramids were built has occupied researchers for a very long time, and new evidence keeps emerging. The Merer Diary, that remarkable papyrus found at Wadi El Jarf, was published in 2017 and gave us the first direct textual evidence of the logistics of pyramid construction from someone who was directly involved. The excavations at the workers' village at Giza have continued to yield new information about the lives of the builders. Remote sensing technologies, including ground-penetrating radar and muon tomography, have been used to probe the interior of the pyramid structures without disturbing them, and have revealed previously unknown spaces. In 2017, the Scan Pyramids project announced the discovery of a large void inside the Great Pyramid using muon tomography, a technique that uses cosmic ray particles to image the interior of dense structures, similar in principle to an X-ray. The void, which the researchers called the Big Void, is located above the Grand Gallery in the interior of the pyramid. It is at least 30 meters long. Its purpose is unknown. It could be a construction void, left deliberately to relieve weight on the passages below. It could be an undiscovered chamber. It could be something else entirely. No one has been inside it, and accessing it without damage to the pyramid would be extremely difficult. The discovery was significant because it showed that even after centuries of study, the pyramids can still yield surprises. There is something fitting about this. The pyramids are old enough and large enough that they contain their own secrets, sealed inside stone, accessible only by indirect means, resisting full disclosure even to the most sophisticated modern technology. They are not transparent. They do not give up everything at once. Let's take a moment to think about the relationship between knowledge and wonder, because this is something the pyramids illustrate in a very clear way. There is sometimes an assumption that understanding something diminishes it, that once you know how something works, the mystery is gone, and with the mystery, some of the fascination. This assumption is not entirely wrong. Learning that a magic trick is done with mirrors does, in fact, take something away from the experience of watching it. But the pyramids are different, and the reason they are different is instructive. We know an enormous amount about how they were built, who built them, roughly when, and something about why. And this knowledge does not diminish them. A person who knows about the logistics of the pyramid construction, who understands the organization of the workforce and the movement of stone over water and the precision of the surveying, encounters the pyramids with no less wonder than a person who knows nothing. In some ways, more, because the knowledge adds a dimension. The physical structure becomes a window into human capacity and human ambition and human effort in a way that a purely mysterious object cannot be. This is a pattern worth noticing. Real understanding, when it arrives, often adds rather than subtracts. It changes the character of the fascination rather than ending it. The pyramids, once you understand something about how they were built, are no longer just mysterious objects in the desert. They are the solidified result of an enormous collective human project. A project that involved thousands of people over decades, that required the organization and coordination of resources across hundreds of miles, that was driven by a religious and political belief system that we can partially understand and partially only glimpse. That is more interesting than the mystery alone, and the mystery is still there, because understanding part of something does not mean understanding all of it. The pyramid builders are gone. The pharaoh Khufu is gone, or at least whatever physical remains he left behind were removed from his pyramid long ago and have never been found. The civilization that produced these structures persisted for thousands of years after the Pyramid Age, and then dissolved, slowly, under the pressure of conquest and time, its language ceasing to be spoken as a living tongue, its religious system giving way to others. What we have left is the stone, and the slow work of scholars reading fragmentary evidence to piece together what they can. There is something moving about this, about the gap between the ambition of the pyramids and the eventual fate of the civilization that produced them. The pyramids were built to last forever. They were built to ensure the pharaoh's eternal existence. And in one sense, they have lasted, and the pharaoh's name, Khufu, is known to every schoolchild who learns about ancient history. But in another sense, the whole context of meaning within which the pyramid was built is gone. The rituals have stopped. The priests have been silent for centuries. The mortuary cult that was supposed to continue indefinitely has long since ceased to function. The pyramid stands, but the life that was supposed to flow through it has long since ended. This gap between intention and outcome, between what was meant to happen and what actually happened, is itself a kind of meditation on the limits of human ambition when measured against time. Not a pessimistic meditation, but a realistic one. We build things to last, they last, and then the world changes around them, and the meaning they were built to carry shifts into something new, carried by people the original builders could not have imagined, speaking languages that hadn't yet been invented, asking questions the builders never thought to answer. The pyramids have accumulated meanings over millennia in a way that most objects don't. They started as royal tombs within a specific Egyptian religious context. They became tourist attractions for ancient Greek and Roman visitors, objects of historical curiosity. They were absorbed into Islamic cosmology and Arab literature as objects of wonder and mysterious power. They became, in the European imagination of the 17th and 18th centuries, symbols of ancient wisdom and esoteric knowledge, inspiring Freemasonry and various occult traditions. They became symbols of Egypt as a nation and a culture. They became among the most reproduced images in the world, appearing on everything from currency to corporate branding. They have been the subject of serious scholarly study for over 2 centuries, and they remain, through all of this accumulation of meaning and interpretation, somewhat resistant being fully explained. That resistance is part of their fascination, and it is worth asking why it exists. Why do the pyramids continue to generate questions even in the face of extensive study? Why does the feeling of mystery persist even when we know quite a lot? Part of the answer is scale. There is a threshold at which physical scale produces an experience that cannot be fully absorbed. The pyramids are above that threshold. No matter how much you know about them, when you stand in front of them, you experience something that exceeds what your knowledge can contain. Part of the answer is age. Time of this magnitude is not something the human mind can fully process. We can handle years, and perhaps decades, and maybe even a century or two. But 4,500 years is beyond our emotional grasp in a way that our intellectual grasp cannot compensate for. We know the number, we don't feel it, and that gap between knowing and feeling keeps the pyramids charged with something that information alone can't discharge. Part of the answer is silence. The pyramids don't explain themselves. They don't have a plaque that says, definitively, here is what we mean. The texts we have from ancient Egypt are rich, but they don't provide a direct statement of the pyramid's meaning, certainly not in the voice of the pharaoh for whom it was built. The pyramid texts are liturgical in character, dense with religious symbolism that requires expertise to interpret, and that yields different interpretations depending on who is reading them. The administrative papyri give us logistics, but not theology. The architecture gives us precision and scale, but not intention, or not clearly. We are always working with inference and interpretation, which means we are always working with uncertainty. Uncertainty of a certain kind keeps attention alive. If everything about the pyramids were resolved, if there were no remaining questions, if every decision made by the builders were known and every symbol fully decoded, the pyramids would still be impressive. But they would be impressive in a different, flatter way. They would be impressive the way a very large machine is impressive. You can admire the scale of the engineering, but there is nothing pulling you beyond what you can already see and explain. As it is, the pyramids are impressive in a way that keeps pulling. There is always something just beyond the edge of understanding. There is always another question behind the question you've just answered. And this is not a frustrating quality, or not only frustrating. It is also generative. It keeps the mind engaged. It keeps the fascination alive across time. This is a good moment to mention, quietly, that ZzZscience is a channel built exactly around this kind of sustained, gentle engagement with questions that don't resolve quickly. The pyramids are a perfect subject for this kind of attention because they reward slowness and patience and the willingness to sit with uncertainty. Not every question needs an immediate answer. Some questions are better kept open, turned over slowly, allowed to generate more questions rather than fewer. The history of how humans have thought about the pyramids is itself a fascinating story. For much of the medieval period in Europe, the pyramids were understood through biblical and classical frameworks. They appeared in some medieval thought as the granaries of Joseph, the Joseph of the Hebrew Scriptures, who rose to become an important official in Egypt. This identification persisted with surprising tenacity, even after it was fairly clearly incorrect. The interior of the Great Pyramid, which is mostly solid stone, with a small number of passages and chambers, is not well designed for storing grain. But the identification was emotionally satisfying in a way that made it resistant to correction. It connected the mysterious structures of ancient Egypt to a narrative that medieval Europeans already knew and valued. This pattern of assimilating the pyramids into whatever story a culture already has for understanding mysterious things is very consistent across time and across cultures. The pyramids are large enough and old enough and ambiguous enough that they can absorb almost any narrative that someone wants to lay over them. They don't resist interpretation, they just outlast it. Every generation's confident theory about what the pyramids really mean eventually gives way to the next generation's confident theory, and the pyramids continue to stand, unmoved. The Arab scholars of the medieval Islamic world had their own frameworks for the pyramids, many of them fusing practical curiosity with legends about pre-Islamic people of great wisdom. Some traditions held that the pyramids were built before the biblical flood and contained hidden knowledge from a civilization that knew the catastrophe was coming. Others emphasized their engineering achievements and debated the techniques of their construction with a kind of proto-archaeological curiosity. The pyramid complex at Giza was, for the scholars and travelers of the medieval Arab world, a site of active inquiry and wonder, not simply a backdrop. The European encounter with Egypt that began seriously in the 18th century and then dramatically accelerated with Napoleon's Egyptian campaign in 1798 produced what might be called the modern Western imaginary of the pyramids. Napoleon brought scholars and scientists with him, and the Description de l'Égypte, the enormous multi-volume work produced by the expedition's scholars, introduced Egyptian antiquity to European intellectual culture in an unprecedented, systematic way. It was also, of course, a colonial project, part of France's imperial ambitions, and the ways in which European scholarship on ancient Egypt has been shaped by colonial frameworks is a subject that contemporary scholars are actively working through. What the Napoleonic encounter produced was a kind of Egypt mania in European culture. A fascination with Egyptian forms, symbols, and ideas that spread through art, architecture, literature, and eventually popular culture. The obelisks that began to appear in European capitals, most famously in London, Paris, and New York, are physical markers of this fascination. The Egyptian revival style in architecture and interior design became fashionable. The mystery associated with Egypt, and especially with hieroglyphics, which had not yet been deciphered, fed a rich tradition of speculation and romantic projection. The decipherment of hieroglyphics by Jean-François Champollion in the 1820s, using the Rosetta Stone, was one of the great intellectual achievements of the 19th century. It opened up access to thousands of years of Egyptian texts, religious, administrative, literary, and personal, and transformed Egyptology from a field largely dependent on inference from architecture and artifacts into one with access to the voices, however indirect, of ancient Egyptians themselves. This was a profound change. But it didn't, as one might have expected, fully dispel the sense of mystery that surrounded Egyptian civilization. If anything, it deepened the fascination by adding complexity to what had previously been blank projection. When you can't read the inscriptions, anything can be in them. When you can read them, you encounter actual people with actual concerns and actual ideas, and the encounter is richer and also more challenging. The pyramids themselves, unlike most temples and tombs in Egypt, yielded no inscriptions to decode. Their silence remained. And so, even as Egyptology matured into a rigorous discipline capable of illuminating much of ancient Egyptian civilization, the pyramids remained somewhat apart, resistant to the same kind of direct textual interpretation. We are going to continue tomorrow, or perhaps later tonight, exploring what we understand and what we don't, and why the pyramids hold us even in the face of all that we've learned. But for now, let's settle here for a moment. 4,500 years of standing in the desert, through everything that the world has become and forgotten and become again. The pyramids have been there through all of it, and they will be there after tonight, after this conversation, after everything we know about them today has been refined and revised by future scholarship. There is something restful about that, something that the mind can lean against. The pyramid doesn't need anything from you. It doesn't ask you to understand it completely. It doesn't require that you resolve your questions about it. It simply stands there, in the desert, in the dark, in the morning light, in the heat of the afternoon, in the silence and the noise of history and tourism and time. What we understand about the pyramids and what we don't sits side by side in a way that is unusual for something so thoroughly studied. Most subjects, when examined closely enough, begin to close. The questions narrow, the uncertainty shrinks. You might not end up with complete knowledge, but the sense is one of convergence, of information accumulating into a picture that becomes more detailed and more stable over time. The pyramids do this too in some ways. Archaeology has given us real knowledge, as we talked about in the first part of this conversation. We know who built them, roughly when, with what materials, and something about the labor system that made them possible. We know more than any previous generation has known, and future scholarship will certainly know more still. But the pyramids also do something else. They generate new questions as old ones are answered. The discovery of the workers' village told us the labor was not slave labor and answered a question that had been asked for centuries. But it also opened new questions about the relationship between the workers and the state, about what it meant to build such a thing, about whether pride and compulsion and religious devotion were separate experiences or all mixed together in the daily reality of the people who carried stone across the plateau. The discovery of the Mera papyrus told us about logistics that had previously been inferred. But it also made us wonder what other administrative records existed, what other details of the project were written down and have simply not survived, what the full picture of the operation looked like from inside. Every new piece of evidence is also a reminder of how much evidence is gone, dissolved in time, or buried in sand still unexcavated, or lost to the repurposing of stone that has been happening in Egypt for thousands of years. The Big Void, detected by muon tomography in 2017, told us that the interior of the Great Pyramid still holds undiscovered spaces, but it raised more questions than it answered. What is the void? How do you get into it? What, if anything, does it contain? The technology that detected it cannot answer those questions. Answering them would require physical access, and physical access would require drilling or tunneling in ways that the Egyptian government and the international community of Egyptologists are understandably reluctant to sanction. So the void exists, and we know it exists, and we cannot yet know what it is. It sits there inside the mountain of stone, sealed, inaccessible, adding its own particular weight to the sense that the pyramid has not yet told us everything. This is one of the things that distinguishes the pyramids from most other objects of historical study. Their scale means that there is literally more of them to know. The interior is vast and mostly stone, but not entirely stone, and the parts that are not stone remain only partially mapped. The exterior has been studied intensively, but the immediate surroundings of the plateau continue to yield new discoveries as ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing tools are applied more systematically. There are features in the bedrock and the sand around the pyramids that have not yet been fully investigated. There are subsidiary structures whose relationships to the main pyramids are not entirely clear. The pyramid complex is not a single object. It is a landscape, accumulated over decades of construction, modified in later periods, partially dismantled by stone robbers across thousands of years, buried and reburied by desert sand, and still only partially understood. Studying it is less like studying a specific artifact and more like studying a geological formation. There is always more depth, always more lateral spread, always more connection between one part and another than the current picture accounts for. Let's think for a moment about what purpose actually means in the context of the pyramids. The simple answer is that they are tombs, and this is correct in the way that a simple correct answer is correct. It captures the essential function without capturing the full meaning. A modern cemetery is also a place for the dead, but a modern cemetery and the Great Pyramid of Giza are not the same kind of thing, even if they share this basic category. The pyramid was not just a place to put the body. It was a mechanism, a machine built from stone, designed to accomplish a specific set of transformations in the world, understood by its builders. In ancient Egyptian religious thought, the pharaoh was not simply a human ruler. He was a divine figure, the intermediary between the human world and the world of the gods, the living embodiment of Horus and, after death, identified with Osiris. His death was not just the end of a reign. It was a cosmic event that required a complex response. The mortuary rituals, the mummification, the funerary goods, the structure of the tomb itself. All of these were parts of a process meant to ensure the pharaoh's successful transition from the living world to the divine world, and to maintain the cosmic order that his life had sustained. The pyramid, in this context, was not just a container, it was a participant. The geometry of its form, the precision of its alignment, the specific chambers and passages within it, and probably many features that we no longer fully understand, were all doing something within this larger cosmological project. The pyramid was, in the most literal sense the builders would have intended, a sacred object. Not sacred in the vague modern sense of something revered or impressive, but sacred in the precise ancient sense of something belonging to and operating within the divine order of things. This meaning is not accessible to us directly. We can describe it, reconstruct it partially from texts, and trace its outlines in the architecture. But we cannot feel it from the inside, because we are not ancient Egyptians living within that cosmological framework. The beliefs that animated the pyramid for its builders are not our beliefs. And this gap between the intended meaning and any meaning we can fully inhabit is another form of the distance that makes the pyramids feel inexhaustible. What we can feel, and what seems to work across cultures and centuries, is something more basic. The sense that this was built for reasons of ultimate importance. Whatever those reasons were in their specific detail, the scale of the effort speaks to a level of commitment that goes beyond the ordinary. Nobody built the Great Pyramid as a casual project. Nobody built it because it was convenient or efficient, or because it was the quickest way to achieve a pragmatic goal. It was built because it mattered enormously to the people who ordered it and to the people who carried out the work. That urgency, that sense of ultimate importance, is somehow still present in the stone, even when the specific beliefs that generated it have dissolved into history. There is a concept in architecture sometimes called the idea of the monument, which refers to structures built to endure beyond any functional necessity, built as acts of commemoration or assertion or devotion. The monument is not just useful, it is meaningful in excess of its use. And the pyramid is, among other things, one of the earliest and most extreme examples of the monument in human history. The history of labor that built the pyramids is worth returning to, because it is one of the aspects of the story that gets less attention than the engineering, and that is, in many ways, more humanly interesting. We know that the workforce was organized into rotating gangs. Workers from across Egypt would come to the site for a period, probably measured in months, during which they would be fed and housed and would contribute their labor to the project. Then another group would take their place. The agricultural cycle of the Nile Valley created natural periods when workers were available. When the Nile flooded each year, farming was not possible, and the workers who had been farming could be redirected to construction projects. The flood also raised the water level in the canals and channels, making it easier to move heavy stone by boat. This seasonal rhythm gave the construction project a pulse. It was not a continuous flow, but a series of waves, each wave bringing new workers who arrived in a state of relative readiness and departed weeks or months later, having contributed something to a structure that was growing incrementally, block by block, course by course. The food provided to these workers has been estimated, and the scale is startling. The bakeries found in the workers' village at Giza were capable of producing enormous quantities of bread daily. The brewery was similarly impressive. Cattle, sheep, and goats were brought to the site and slaughtered to provide meat. The diet of the pyramid workers, as evidenced by animal bones found in refuse deposits at the site, was by the standards of the ancient world quite good. There was more meat than the average Egyptian villager would have eaten. This was not an accident. The state was investing in the nutritional condition of its workforce because the work demanded physical strength and because keeping the workers healthy and functional was in the state's interest. This matters as a corrective to certain images of ancient construction projects. The mental image of exhausted, malnourished people being driven by overseers with whips is an image that comes partly from Hollywood and partly from a long tradition of projecting modern assumptions about ancient slavery onto the past. The reality, at least as the archaeological evidence suggests it, was different. The workers were not free in the modern sense. They were called to this service by the state, and they did not have the option of declining. But within that framework of obligatory service, they were fed, housed, and cared for. When they were injured, there is evidence of medical treatment, including healed fractures, healed skull injuries, and at least one case of what appears to be a successfully performed amputation. When they died on the job, they were buried with some care, their graves including some funerary objects. Why does this matter? Because it changes the character of the human story behind the pyramids. It is not a story of pure domination and suffering, although it is certainly not a story of free choice either. It is a story of a particular kind of social organization, one in which the state's enormous demands on its population were embedded in a web of reciprocal obligations, in which the workers brought to Giza were being fed better than they would eat at home and were participating in something that was, within their own cultural framework, of cosmic importance. Whether the individual stone carriers and ramp builders felt this importance in an emotionally resonant way, whether they felt pride or meaning or connection to the project, or whether they simply did the work and went home, is something we cannot know. Human beings in any era have a wide range of responses to the work they are compelled to do. Some find meaning in it. Some are simply enduring it. Most probably experience both at different times. The pyramid builders were not a homogeneous mass of sentiment. They were individual people with individual experiences, most of which have left no trace. The graffiti that has been found inside the pyramid, in spaces not intended for public display, the names and slogans of the work gangs, is the closest we get to direct individual voice. Friends of Khufu, the drunken gang. Irreverent and human, written in places where they would never normally be seen, by people who knew that the pyramid was going to close over these inscriptions for potentially forever. There is something almost unbearably vivid about this. The personality coming through in a few words, scratched into stone 4,500 years ago, in a space that no one would open again until archaeologists finally broke through in the 19th century. What did they feel, the person who wrote those words? Exhaustion and pride, and the casual humor of someone in the middle of hard physical work with people they knew well. Probably something like that. The specific words suggest a certain irreverence that is not the reverence of someone terrified of divine punishment. They had enough security in their position, or enough distance from the official religious aura of the project, to make a joke. That joke, across 4,500 years, still lands. The question of why mystery survives, even when knowledge arrives, is one that the pyramids illuminate beautifully, and it is worth spending some time on. In the popular imagination, mystery and knowledge are opposites. You have a mystery, you solve it, and the mystery is gone. This model works well for a detective story, where the point of the exercise is to arrive at a definitive explanation. But it is a poor model for most things we actually encounter in the world, including almost everything of genuine importance. The pyramids have been studied rigorously for 2 centuries. Real archaeologists, trained in real methods, working with real evidence, have produced a substantial body of knowledge about them. And yet the pyramids feel no less mysterious today than they did to the Greek and Roman tourists who visited them in the classical period and marveled at them. In fact, for many people, they feel more mysterious, because the knowledge we have accumulated has not resolved the questions, but has made the questions more precise and more interesting. The mystery that persists is not the vague mystery of complete ignorance, the sense that we know nothing and could imagine anything. It is the sharper mystery of partial knowledge, the sense that we know enough to understand the shape of what we don't know, and that the shape is genuinely surprising and genuinely deep. We know the pyramids were built by human labor. The mystery is not how any human power could have done this. We know it was possible. The mystery is what it felt like to be inside the project, what it cost the people who built it, what it meant to them in ways that went beyond the official theological framework. We know the pyramid was a tomb with specific religious functions. The mystery is not whether it had some other secret purpose that we haven't uncovered. The mystery is the experience of trying to inhabit a belief system that is genuinely foreign and trying to understand what it was like to live inside it. These are different kinds of mystery from the mystery of pure ignorance. They are richer, more specific, more generative. And they survive the arrival of knowledge because they are not resolved by knowledge. They are opened by it. There is also a category of mystery that is not really about information at all. And this is the mystery that the pyramids produce most reliably in most people who encounter them. The mystery of scale, the mystery of age. The mystery of human ambition persisting across time in stone. These are not mysteries that will be resolved by more archaeological data. They are mysteries that arise from the encounter between a human consciousness and something that exceeds its normal capacity to absorb. They are not problems to be solved. They are experiences to be had. When people stand at the base of the Great Pyramid and feel a kind of awe that they can't quite articulate, they are not feeling that awe because they don't know enough. They are feeling it because the pyramid is genuinely, irreducibly astonishing. More knowledge makes the awe more specific and more informed, but it doesn't make the awe go away. This is worth noting because there is a version of the modern attitude toward ancient things that treats wonder and knowledge as being in tension with each other, as if increasing understanding should progressively diminish the sense of mystery and awe until, at the limit of perfect understanding, everything would be flat and obvious. But this is not the experience of people who have spent their lives studying the pyramids. The archaeologists, the historians, the Egyptologists who know the most about these structures are not people who have had the wonder educated out of them. They tend to be people for whom the wonder has become more precise, more layered, more deeply rooted in actual engagement with the evidence. Knowing more has made the pyramids more astonishing to them, not less. This is something about the character of genuine understanding, as opposed to the kind of superficial familiarity that can feel like understanding. Genuine understanding tends to reveal complexity and depth rather than reducing them. The more carefully you look at almost anything real, the more interesting it becomes. The pyramids, which have been looked at with extraordinary care for a very long time, have rewarded that looking with increasing richness rather than with diminishing returns. The relationship between repetition and fascination is another thing the pyramids illuminate. One of the most counterintuitive features of human psychology is that some things do not become less interesting with familiarity. Most things do. The excitement of a new food, a new place, a new person, fades as the novelty wears off. But certain kinds of things that have genuine depth or genuine beauty or genuine presence, seem to resist this process. They become familiar without becoming boring. You have seen the image 100 times, and then you see it again, and something of the original response is still there. The Eiffel Tower is another example. Billions of photographs have been taken of it. Its image appears on every kind of merchandise and in every kind of media. And yet, when people actually arrive in Paris and see it for the first time, or sometimes even after many visits, they feel something real. The image has not exhausted the reality. The image has, perhaps, set up a kind of expectation or framework that the reality then fills and exceeds. The pyramids have this quality to an extreme degree. They may be the most reproduced images in human history if you count all the representations of the pyramid form across all cultures and all time. And yet, the actual structures, in the actual desert, under the actual sky, produce a response that the millions of images have not foreclosed. Why? One possible explanation is that the photograph can convey shape and even some sense of scale, but it cannot convey presence. Presence is a quality that arises from being in a specific place, with a specific thing, from the air and the light and the temperature and the sound and the smell and the physical position of your body in relation to the object. Photographs strip all of that away. What remains is information, but not experience. And experience is what the pyramids are most about. Another possible explanation is that some objects operate on a scale that is simply beyond what the two-dimensional image can represent. The photograph of the Great Pyramid shows you a triangle. A large triangle, obviously, with texture and shadow, but a shape that the eye can take in at a glance and file away. The actual Great Pyramid cannot be taken in at a glance because it is too large. When you are close enough to see the texture of the individual stones, you are too close to see the whole shape. When you are far enough away to see the whole shape, you can no longer see the individual stones. There is no single point from which the pyramid presents itself in a way that the mind can fully receive all at once. You have to move around it, look up at it, step back, approach again. It refuses to be apprehended in a single view. And this refusal to be fully seen from any one position is one of the things that keeps it interesting. Silence, too, is part of what makes the pyramids what they are, and this is something that can be very difficult to convey in any medium. The silence of the desert around the pyramid plateau, in the early morning or the late evening, is a physical quality. It is not merely the absence of noise, it is a presence of its own. The desert is an environment of such radical reduction, so stripped of the normal density of vegetation and moisture and organic life, that the silence has a quality that is different from the silence of a room, or even the silence of a forest. It is an old silence, a silence that has been going on for a long time. The pyramids sit in this silence. They produce very little sound themselves, though on certain days the wind can produce a low sound moving over the exposed stone. Mostly they simply sit there, as they have for millennia, and the silence flows around them and through the plateau and out into the desert beyond. This silence is part of why visiting the pyramids early in the morning, before the tourists and the vendors and the sound systems of the tourist attractions arrive, is a qualitatively different experience from visiting in the middle of the day. The silence lets you feel the age of the place in a way that noise prevents. There is a philosophical tradition that associates silence with truth, or at least with the conditions under which truth can be approached. Mystics and contemplatives across many traditions have valued silence as the environment in which the deeper levels of experience become accessible. Whatever we make of the specific metaphysical claims embedded in these traditions, the experiential observation seems right. In silence, certain kinds of attention are possible that cannot be sustained in the midst of noise. The pyramids, in their proper silence, invite a quality of attention that is rare in ordinary life. This is another reason why they fascinate. They create conditions for an unusual mode of consciousness. Not a mystical consciousness necessarily, but a quieter, more receptive mode of awareness that most people don't often access in daily life. The experience of the pyramids, at its best, is partly an experience of being brought into this mode of awareness by the specific qualities of the environment. We live, most of us, in environments of extraordinary noise and busyness. The silence of the desert and the pyramids is a counterpoint to that, and the contrast makes it striking in a way that it might not be for someone who lived in that kind of silence all the time. We notice what we are not used to. We are moved by what differs from our baseline, and for most contemporary people, the silence and the scale and the age of the pyramid complex is so far from the baseline of daily experience that it produces a kind of shock. Not an unpleasant shock, but a jolt into a different register of awareness. The pyramids also represent something about the relationship between the individual and the collective that resonates in ways that vary by era, but never entirely disappear. One person did not build the Great Pyramid. One person could not have imagined it in full, could not have organized it, could not have funded it, could not have supplied it, could not have executed it. It was a collective project of a kind that required the coordination of a state, and yet it was built for one person, or at least in honor of one person, the pharaoh Khufu. The tension between this collective effort and this individual focus is interesting. The thousands of workers whose labor went into every block of stone, whose names are mostly lost, whose daily lives and experiences and individual stories have dissolved into time. All of that is subsumed into a structure that commemorates a single royal individual. Is this an injustice? In modern terms, perhaps. In the terms of the culture that produced it, probably not. Or at least, not in the same way. The pharaoh was not, within that framework, simply a powerful individual. He was the embodiment of a cosmic principle, and his continued existence after death was not just his personal concern, but the concern of the entire universe as understood by ancient Egyptian theology. The workers who built his pyramid were not simply serving his vanity. They were participating in the maintenance of cosmic order, or that is one way of thinking about it. And there is also another way, which is that ideology of whatever kind has often been used to mobilize collective labor for projects that served the interests of a relatively small group. The Egyptian state was a hierarchical structure in which the pharaoh and his inner circle controlled resources and labor at a scale that enabled projects like the pyramids. The religious framework that justified this arrangement was, from one point of view, a sincere expression of the society's deepest beliefs and values. From another point of view, it was a system that made enormous demands on ordinary people while concentrating the benefits at the top. Both of these things can be true simultaneously. This is a characteristic of complex societies that has been true from the earliest states to the present. The systems that enable large-scale collective projects are always also systems of inequality and power, and they are always also, sometimes, systems that produce genuine shared values and shared meaning. The pyramid builders may have felt pride and meaning in their work. They were also subject to a state apparatus that had the power to compel their labor. These are not contradictions to be resolved. They are the texture of social reality. What the pyramids give us, when we look at them with this complexity in mind, is not a simple story. They are not a pure symbol of human achievement, uncomplicated by the conditions under which they were achieved. They are not a simple symbol of oppression either, because the evidence doesn't support them. Most extreme version of that story. They are a monument to the extraordinary things that human social organization can accomplish, and also a monument to the cost of that accomplishment. And the cost is partly carried by people whose names we have mostly lost. This complexity is part of why the pyramids continue to generate debate. They are not simple. They do not yield simple meanings. And in a cultural moment, when there is increasing attention to whose stories are told and whose labor is acknowledged, the question of who actually built the pyramids, not just in the technical sense, but in the human sense, is a question that has new resonance. The story has always been more about the thousands of workers than about the single pharaoh, if we are honest about where the actual making happened. And that story, the story of the organized human effort, the graffiti on the walls, the healed bones in the graves, the industrial bakeries, is the most fully human part of the pyramid story. The image of the pyramids has circulated through human culture so widely and for so long that it has developed a kind of independent existence, separate from the actual structures in the desert. The pyramid as symbol appears in contexts so varied that it is difficult to trace the full spread of its influence. The eye and pyramid image on the American $1 bill, often cited in conspiracy theories about secret societies and hidden power, comes from a tradition of Enlightenment symbolism that associated the pyramid with ancient wisdom and the eye with divine providence. It was adopted for the Great Seal of the United States and has been on the currency since 1935. The Freemasons, who drew heavily on ancient Egyptian symbolism in the 18th century, contributed to this association between pyramids and esoteric knowledge, though the actual connection between Freemasonry and ancient Egypt is quite thin historically. The pyramid appears in corporate logos, in architectural design, art from the Renaissance forward. I. M. Pei's glass pyramid at the Louvre, completed in 1989, is one of the most famous modern architectural references to the ancient form. It caused considerable controversy when it was proposed, seen by many as a jarring intrusion of modernity into a historic space. But it has over time become an inseparable part of the Louvre's image, a testament to how the pyramid form can absorb new context and new meaning without losing its fundamental character. Pyramid-shaped structures appear in modern architecture around the world, from the Transamerica Pyramid in San Francisco to the Pyramid Arena in Memphis, Tennessee, to the Glass Pyramid of the Louvre. Each of these is drawing on a visual vocabulary that the ancient pyramids established, and each is doing something slightly different with it. The modern pyramid building is typically not a tomb. It is not a cosmic instrument. It is a building that borrows the stability and the visual power of the pyramid form for purposes of commerce or culture or civic identity. The shape carries associations of permanence, of ancient wisdom, of a certain kind of grandeur, and modern architects have found those associations useful. The persistence of the pyramid form across thousands of years of architectural history is itself a statement about the power of the original. Shapes that do not have genuine visual and psychological force do not persist in this way. They get used once or twice and then discarded. The pyramid form has been continuously available to architects and designers for thousands of years because it continues to work. It continues to produce the response it was producing in the 4th millennium BCE. That is a remarkable kind of staying power for any formal idea. There is also a non-Egyptian tradition of pyramid building that runs parallel to the Egyptian one, the stepped pyramids of Mesoamerica. The Mayan and Aztec pyramids, which are superficially similar to the Egyptian ones, arose independently and served somewhat different purposes, are another piece of evidence for the formal power of the pyramid shape. Different cultures, on different continents, with no contact between them, independently arrived at the pyramid form for their most significant religious structures. This parallel development suggests that there is something about the form itself, its stability, its visual clarity, its symbolic resonance, that makes it a natural choice for human cultures building toward heaven or aspiring toward the sacred. The specific religious meanings were different. The Mesoamerican pyramids were not primarily tombs, but platforms for temples and for ritual activities including sacrifice. Their stepped profiles are distinctive and different from the smooth-sided Egyptian form. But both traditions chose the basic pyramid shape, a wide, stable base tapering upward to an apex. Both place their most important religious and ritual activities in connection with this form. The convergence is striking and has been discussed by scholars of comparative religion and architecture. It does not require an explanation in terms of shared origins or ancient contact. It can be explained by the fact that the pyramid is a shape that works, visually and structurally and symbolically, in ways that other shapes do not, and that different human cultures exploring the architecture of the sacred independently arrive at it. This parallel development is another thing that adds depth to the fascination with pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza is not just an Egyptian monument. It is one of the most perfect expressions of a formal idea that appears to have genuine cross-cultural resonance. The form speaks across cultural difference in a way that more culturally specific forms do not. A person from any culture standing before a Great Pyramid will feel something of the same weight of presence, the same pulling of attention upward and inward, regardless of whether they have any knowledge of the specific history of the structure. The cross-cultural appeal of the pyramid is connected to something basic about human visual perception, and perhaps about human symbolic thinking. The triangle pointing upward is a form that appears in the visual vocabularies of many cultures as a symbol of aspiration, of hierarchy, of connection between earth and sky. The mountain, which the pyramid imitates, is the most ancient of these symbols, a natural form that rises from the earth and reaches toward heaven, that is visible from great distances, that provides orientation in the landscape. Every culture that has lived near mountains has developed symbolic uses for them. The pyramid is, among other things, an artificial mountain, and it carries the symbolic weight of natural mountains into contexts like the flat plains of the Nile Delta, where natural mountains don't exist. We might pause here, quietly, to note something about how ZzZscience thinks about subjects like this. The goal is not to reach a definitive conclusion. It never quite is. The goal is to move slowly through the layers of a subject, letting each layer be what it is, not forcing resolution where genuine ambiguity exists. The pyramids are a subject that rewards this approach particularly well, because they have so many layers, and because the layers are so different in character from each other. There is the engineering layer, and the historical layer, and the psychological layer, and the symbolic layer, and the experiential layer, and none of them reduces to any of the others. The pyramids are also, among everything else, a subject about time, and about the human relationship to time. The experience of standing before something ancient is not the same as the intellectual knowledge that something is ancient. You can know that the Great Pyramid is 4,500 years old and have that be simply information. But when you stand before it, under the open sky, with the desert behind you and the city in the distance, and you feel the age of it as something closer to physical, something the body registers as well as the mind, that is a different kind of knowing. It is a kind of knowing that the image on a screen or a page cannot provide. This is part of why people go to Giza rather than simply watching a documentary. The documentary can provide more information than most visits will. It can show details of the interior that tourists never see. It can present expert commentary and architectural analysis and historical context at a level of depth that no guided tour can match. And yet people continue to travel from every part of the world at considerable expense and effort to stand at the base of these structures and look up. Because the information is not the point, the experience is the point. And the experience is something you can only have in person. This insistence on presence, on the value of being physically in a place, is something the pyramids have always generated. Even in the ancient world, people traveled long distances to see them. Greek and Roman tourists from the classical period were not without impressive monuments in their own cultures. The Parthenon existed. The Roman Forum was an impressive urban space. The temples of Greece and Rome and the Near East were, by any ordinary measure, remarkable structures. And still people made the journey to Egypt, specifically to see the pyramids, because there was something there that could not be found elsewhere. What they were seeking, and what modern visitors are seeking, is the encounter with scale and age at the extreme end of human experience. This is not something that can be found just anywhere. It requires something like the Great Pyramid, something that is actually and genuinely extraordinary in these dimensions. And the fact that this seeking has been continuous, that there has been an unbroken tradition of people traveling to Giza to have this experience, from the classical period to the present day, is itself part of the pyramid's meaning. The pyramids have been drawing human attention for as long as we have written records of human attention. They are one of the most enduring foci of human wonder in the historical record. What does it mean to be an object of wonder for 4,000 years? It means that the object has something genuine, genuinely extreme in its properties, genuine enough that it keeps producing the relevant response across vast differences of culture and historical circumstance and individual personality. The pyramids have been wondered at by Herodotus and by Julius Caesar, and by Napoleon and by Agatha Christie, who visited them and wrote about them, and by millions of ordinary travelers whose responses were never recorded. All of these people, separated by centuries and by enormous cultural difference, came to the same place and had a version of the same experience. The experience of standing before something that exceeds ordinary expectation. That consistency is not an accident. It is a property of the pyramids themselves. Familiar things that never become ordinary are rare. We can think of some. The night sky is one. The ocean is another. Mountains in their own way. These are things that retain their capacity to astonish, even after a lifetime of encounter with them. The pyramids belong in this category. Their familiarity from images and popular culture does not seem to exhaust their actual strangeness when encountered directly. The reason familiar things can be this way is that they operate on a level that exceeds the familiar dimension of them. The night sky is familiar as an image, something we have seen all our lives. But it is genuinely infinite in a way that the familiar image does not capture. The ocean is familiar as a concept, but genuinely vast in a way that has to be experienced to be understood. The pyramids are familiar as shapes, but genuinely ancient and genuinely massive in ways that images and words approximate but do not fully carry. This gap between the familiar and the actual is what the experience of the pyramids keeps crossing. You arrive with the image firmly in mind, confident that you know what to expect. And then you are there, and the gap closes, and the actual thing arrives with all the properties that the image had been quietly omitting. The weight of the stone, the specific quality of the light on the pale limestone, the way the angle of the slope changes as you move close, the stones nearest to you looming directly overhead, while the distant summit seems impossibly remote. The sound of your own footsteps, and the comparative silence of everything else. All of this lands in a way that the image never prepared you for, even after you have seen 1,000 images. And in that landing, something is felt that is hard to name, and that is the essential experience the pyramids offer. The experience of actually encountering something genuinely extraordinary, rather than simply knowing about it. Knowledge that does not erase wonder is a gift, when you can find it. Most knowledge in everyday life is consoling precisely because it reduces surprise. You understand how traffic lights work, and they no longer seem mysterious. You understand how a microwave heats food, and the process is no longer puzzling. You understand the rules of a game, and the random events within it are no longer random. They are probable or improbable. This is the ordinary function of knowledge, to convert the unknown into the expected, to bring things within the circle of the manageable and the predictable. But there is a category of knowledge that doesn't do this. Knowledge of the very large, very old, very deep, or very complex sometimes produces not a reduction of wonder, but an intensification of it. Learning the actual distances between stars doesn't make the night sky less astonishing. It makes it more so. Learning the actual depth of geological time doesn't make the history of life on Earth less impressive. It makes it more so. Learning the actual details of how the pyramids were built, with actual human beings carrying actual stones over actual distances in an actual organization that we can partially reconstruct, doesn't make them less astonishing. The pyramids belong in this category, the category of things that get more interesting the more you know about them, not less. There is a kind of intellectual pleasure in this. The experience of learning something about the pyramids and feeling the wonder deepen, rather than diminish, is a particular kind of intellectual pleasure. The pleasure of encountering reality at its most genuinely complex and rich. This pleasure is available regardless of how much you already know. There is always more that is known and unknown, more depth to the engineering, more complexity to the religious meaning, more human detail in the lives of the workers, more precision in the astronomical alignments, more subtlety in the relationship between the pyramids and the landscape they inhabit. We have been moving slowly through the pyramids tonight, as is appropriate for something this old and this deep. And we will continue in the same way for a while longer, because there is more to say, and because the quality of slow, sustained attention that the pyramids invite is the quality that serves them best. The silence is still there, on the plateau at Giza, right now, in the dark hours before dawn. The pyramid is still standing. The stones are the same stones they have always been. And the question we keep approaching, the question of why they hold us, why we return to them again and again in thought and in person and in imagination, is a question that the next part of this conversation will continue to explore. Not to answer it, to continue exploring it. There is a particular kind of human need that the pyramids seem to address, and it is not a need that is easy to name precisely. It is not the need for entertainment, though the pyramids are, in the most literal sense of the word, spectacular. It is not purely the need for knowledge, though they generate and sustain a lifetime of inquiry. It is something closer to the need for an anchor, something that does not move, something that was there before you and will be there after you. Something that situates you in time without requiring you to understand time fully. We live in a world that changes faster than human psychology was designed to track. The pace of transformation in almost every domain of life, technological, social, cultural, political, has accelerated beyond what previous generations experienced. This acceleration is not inherently bad. Many of the changes are improvements, and the speed at which problems can now be identified and addressed is in many ways remarkable. But speed has a psychological cost. The cost is a kind of groundlessness, a difficulty finding stable reference points, a tendency to feel as though the floor is always slightly shifting. The pyramids offer, among everything else they offer, a counterpoint to this. They are not shifting. They are the opposite of shifting. They have been standing in the same place, in roughly the same form, since before almost everything we know existed. Whatever changes around them, and enormous changes have come and gone while they stood there, the pyramids absorb without changing. They are, in their physical presence, a kind of argument against the total dominance of change. Not an argument that change is bad, simply an argument that not everything moves. This argument is made, not in words, but in stone. And because it is made in stone, it has a quality of evidence that no verbal assertion could match. You cannot talk the pyramids into having been built recently. You cannot argue them out of their age. They have the absolute authority of the physical fact, which is a kind of authority that is rare and that carries a particular weight in a world saturated with contestable claims. Cultural memory works in ways that are layered and sometimes contradictory. The pyramids are part of the cultural memory of Egypt, of the Arab world, of the African continent, and of human civilization broadly. And each of these contexts gives them a slightly different significance. Within Egypt, they are a source of national pride and identity, a symbol of the extraordinary depth of Egyptian civilization, a reminder that the country, now known as Egypt, is the heir to one of the most extraordinary cultures in human history. This is not a simple inheritance. Modern Egypt is a different culture from ancient Egypt in almost every way, religiously, linguistically, politically. But the pyramids provide a thread of physical continuity that spans the gap, a presence that links the contemporary Egyptian to a past that is otherwise inaccessible. For the broader Arab world, the pyramids have a more complex cultural meaning. They predate Islam and predate Arabic, and so they belong to a pre-Islamic past that has historically been viewed with ambivalence within Islamic culture. The tradition of iconoclasm in some strains of Islamic thought has sometimes produced hostility to the monuments of pre-Islamic civilizations, seen as relics of idolatry and paganism. But this hostility has generally been tempered, in the case of the pyramids, by a competing tradition of wonder and admiration that runs deep in Arabic literature and thought. The pyramids appear in Arabic poetry and prose, going back more than 1,000 years, usually as objects of astonishment and meditations on the passage of time, on the transience of human power, on the mystery of great works whose builders are long gone. For Western culture, the pyramids have served as a kind of primary image of the ancient world, one of the first things that comes to mind when the word ancient is used. This primacy is not simply a result of the pyramids being the oldest things. There are older structures in the world. The megalithic monument of Göbekli Tepe in what is now Turkey, which was built beginning around 12,000 years ago, is far older than the Egyptian pyramids. Stonehenge is roughly contemporaneous with the early stages of pyramid building in Egypt. But neither Göbekli Tepe nor Stonehenge has achieved the same cultural centrality in the Western imagination that the pyramids have. Why? Part of the answer is writing. Ancient Egypt left behind a literate record, hieroglyphic inscriptions and papyri that connect the monuments to documented human history in a way that the nameless builders of Göbekli Tepe and Stonehenge did not. The pyramids are embedded in a historical narrative that includes named pharaohs, documented dynasties, and connections to biblical and classical traditions that European culture absorbed as foundational. The builders of Stonehenge are genuinely anonymous. The builder of the Great Pyramid has a name, Khufu. That difference in historical connectedness makes the Egyptian pyramids feel more like part of our history, however distant, and less like a remnant of a world entirely foreign to us. Part of the answer is also the specific tradition of Greek and Roman travel writing that established the pyramids as canonical wonders. The ancient Greeks, who were the primary intellectual ancestors of Western civilization as it developed, wrote about the pyramids in terms that European scholars inherited. Herodotus's account, however inaccurate in some details, was read by educated Europeans for centuries. The pyramids were in the list. They were in the category. They were part of what antiquity meant, in the European imagination, in a way that other ancient monuments were not. And part of the answer, as we have been exploring throughout this conversation, is the scale. The pyramids are simply bigger than almost anything else built by human hands before the modern era. Scale is memorable. Scale produces the kind of impression that survives cultural transmission and retelling. If you have heard about the pyramids and you encounter them, even if you have only heard a garbled account, you will recognize them. The sheer bigness is unmistakable and impossible to confuse with anything else. The question of permanence is worth sitting with for a while, because it is one of the things that most persistently draws human attention to the pyramids, and it connects to something very deep in human psychology. Human beings are, so far as we know, the only creatures who are explicitly aware of their own mortality. We know from early in our conscious lives that we will die. We don't know exactly when. We can make rough, probabilistic estimates, but the fact is clear. There is a limit, and we are inside it, and the limit is not our choice. This awareness runs through everything we do, often below the level of explicit thought. It shapes what we value, how we spend time, what we build, what we remember, and try to be remembered for. Ernest Becker, in his book The Denial of Death, argued that much of human culture is an attempt to manage the terror of this awareness, to create symbolic systems that give meaning and continuity to individual lives that are, in biological terms, brief and fragile. Whether or not you find Becker's framework entirely convincing, the observation that humans are unusually invested in permanence, in leaving something behind, in being remembered, seems correct. We write books and compose music and build buildings and have children and fund institutions and carve names in stone, all in various ways gesturing toward a duration that exceeds our own lifetimes. The pyramids are the most extreme expression of this impulse in the archaeological record. The pharaoh Khufu did not build a modest tomb. He built the largest structure on earth, out of materials chosen for their durability, positioned in a desert that preserves rather than destroys, designed with a precision that spoke of permanence as much as function. The scale of the investment in permanence is staggering. It required the organized labor of a large fraction of the entire Egyptian state's resources over 2 decades or more. The commitment to lasting was total. And it worked. Khufu's name is known, his monument is standing, his bid for permanence, on its own terms, succeeded in a way that almost nothing else from the same era has. The civilization that produced him is gone. The religious system that gave his life meaning is no longer practiced by anyone. The very language in which he would have thought and spoken is no longer spoken by a living community. And yet the pyramid stands, and the name is known, and something of his existence has reached across 4,500 years to us. Is this permanence? Not exactly. It is a trace, an enormously substantial trace, but still a trace. The actual person, the actual experience of being Khufu, is gone as thoroughly as the experience of being any anonymous worker on his pyramid. What remains is a monument and a name and a few administrative references, and the work of scholars interpreting fragments. This is not the continuation of the self that the Egyptian mortuary religion was designed to ensure. The pyramid failed, in the most important sense, on its own terms. The body was removed. The mortuary cult ceased. The magical protections that were supposed to secure the pharaoh's eternal existence did not, in the event, secure anything that we can now observe. But in another sense, something has lasted. Not the pharaoh himself, but the evidence of his existence and his ambition and his time. And perhaps that is what permanence actually looks like, when it is achieved, not the survival of the self, which is probably not possible, but the survival of evidence, the survival of a mark, something in the world that says, here, this was made by a human being, this was the scale of what was attempted, this was the ambition and the belief and the effort. There is something both humbling and exhilarating about this. Humbling because even the most extraordinary attempt at permanence eventually reduces to traces and fragments. Exhilarating because traces and fragments can last an extraordinarily long time. The Great Pyramid is a fragment of what it was meant to be. The body is gone, the casing stones are gone, the religious function has ceased, the interior contents are gone. What remains is the core, stripped of its outer layer, its chambers empty, its intended purpose unfulfilled. And this fragment is still the most imposing structure most people will ever stand before in their lives. If the fragment is this, what was the whole? This question, impossible to fully answer, is part of what keeps the pyramids alive in the imagination. We are always seeing them in a state of partial erosion, partial loss. The complete version, the gleaming white casing stone reflecting the desert sun, the capstone in place, the mortuary complex active, The priests conducting rituals, the workers' village bustling, the canals carrying stone, all of this is gone. What we have is the skeleton, a magnificent skeleton. But we are always aware, or should be aware, that we are looking at something less than it was. That adds a dimension of loss to the encounter, and loss of this kind, loss on this scale, has its own particular weight. It is a weight that does not lead to simple sadness. It is more like the bittersweet quality of looking at something very beautiful that is also finite. The beauty is not diminished by the finitude, it may be intensified by it. The great things that have partially survived are often more moving than they would be if they were perfectly preserved, because the damage speaks to time in a way that perfection would not. The Venus de Milo, the armless Greek statue, is perhaps more compelling precisely because the arms are gone, and imagination must complete her. The incomplete Parthenon, its frieze partially removed and distributed to museums, speaks to a longer and more complicated history than a perfectly preserved temple would. The stripped and eroded Great Pyramid speaks to 4,000 years of weather and human activity in a way that the original gleaming structure could not have. Ruin has its own aesthetic, its own emotional register. Humans have been moved by ruins since at least the classical period, and the 18th century in Europe produced a specific romantic tradition of ruin appreciation, the melancholy pleasure of standing in the remnants of something once great. The pyramids partake of this tradition without being fully consumed by it. They are too large and too structurally intact to be simply ruins in the usual sense. But they have the ruin quality of incompleteness, of damage, of the gap between what was intended and what survived. Why do humans return to the same questions? This is a question about the pyramids specifically, and about human intellectual and emotional life more generally. There are questions that we keep coming back to, not because they can never be answered, but because something about their nature makes them generative rather than terminal. They produce more inquiry the more they are pursued, rather than less. The pyramids host several of these questions. How were they built? This question has been partially answered and will continue to be further answered, and will never be completely answered because too much of the evidence is gone. Why were they built? This question has a basic answer. They were tombs with religious functions. But the depth and specificity of that answer keeps expanding as we learn more about Egyptian religion and society. And there are aspects of the answer that we may never fully reach, because the belief system that animated them is not directly accessible from the outside. What did they mean to the people who built them? This is even less answerable than the previous questions, because meaning is experienced from inside a consciousness, and the consciousness of an ancient Egyptian pyramid worker is not accessible to us. But the inaccessibility of final answers does not make these questions uninteresting. It makes them the opposite. The questions that can be definitively answered with a small number of facts tend to be the least interesting questions, because once answered, they stop producing. The questions that keep generating inquiry, that produce more refined versions of themselves as knowledge accumulates, that connect to other questions across multiple domains. Those are the questions worth staying with. The pyramids generate exactly this kind of question. They sit at the intersection of engineering history and religious history, and social history, and the history of labor, and the history of ideas, and the archaeology of the ancient world, and the psychology of human response to scale and age. They connect to questions about what human beings are capable of when organized toward a common purpose, and to questions about the cost of that organization, and to questions about what we mean when we say something is sacred, and to questions about what permanence is possible and what form it takes. These are not small questions. They are the kinds of questions that a thoughtful person could pursue for a lifetime and still find new angles at the end. The pyramids are, in this sense, inexhaustible. Not because they are magical or because they contain literal secrets that have not yet been discovered, though they may contain physical secrets in the form of undiscovered chambers and passages. They are inexhaustible because they are genuinely complex, and because they connect to the deepest questions we have about human life and human ambition and human time. There is a quality to very old things that is difficult to describe, and that seems to work on a level below explicit thought. When you are in the presence of something genuinely ancient, something that has been continuous for a span of time that dwarfs your own existence, something happens in the body as well as the mind. The scale of the time produces a kind of somatic response that is different from the intellectual recognition of the number. The word ancient, by itself, doesn't carry this. A documentary about the pyramids, however good, doesn't fully carry it. But being in the presence of the thing itself, with the stone right there, with the reality of 4,500 years of continuous existence pressing on the air around you, seems to produce something physical. A shift in the breath, a change in the quality of attention, a kind of stillness that arrives without being sought. This is not a mystical experience, or not necessarily. It may simply be the result of the mind encountering something that requires it to adjust its normal operating parameters. The normal operating parameters are calibrated for a world of human time, of lifetimes and decades and centuries at the outer edge. When the mind encounters something that has been continuous for 45 centuries, it has to stretch in a way that takes energy and that leaves a residue. The residue is the feeling of having been, for a moment, in contact with a scale of time that your ordinary consciousness cannot contain. The comfort of something that does not move is hard to overstate in the context of how most people live now. We are surrounded by things that change. The interfaces we use to communicate, the buildings in our neighborhoods, the companies we work for, the cultural references that feel current, the political situations in our countries, the prices of things, the names and faces of the famous. Very little in ordinary contemporary life is stable in the way that the word stable implies something that has been standing for centuries. Almost everything is in the process of becoming something else. This is not a complaint, merely an observation about the character of contemporary experience. The pyramid's refusal to change, its absolute persistence in the face of everything that has tried to change it, weather and time and theft, and centuries of being stripped for building material, and the general entropy that claims everything else, is something that the mind can rest against. Not with the expectation that the pyramid will protect you from change in your own life. That would be magical thinking. But with the simpler recognition that something exists that has not moved, that change has not consumed everything, that there are kinds of persistence possible in the physical world that exceed what we typically expect. This is a quiet comfort. It doesn't solve anything. It doesn't change the facts of anyone's life. But it is real, and it is one of the things that people report when they try to describe what it means to them to know that the pyramids are there. Not the knowledge as intellectual content, but the knowledge as a fact about the world. The fact that they have been there since before almost everything, and that they are likely to be there after almost everything we know has changed beyond recognition, is a fact that does something to the internal landscape of a person who really takes it in. People have been taking it in this way for as long as they have been encountering the pyramids. The Greek poet who stood before them and wrote about the impossibility of describing them. The Arab scholar of the medieval period who climbed toward the summit and tried to count the courses of stone. The Napoleonic expedition member who measured the base with careful instruments and found the precision almost unbelievable. The modern tourist who arrives jet-lagged and stands at the base in the morning heat and finds that no preparation was adequate. All of these people had, in different ways, the same fundamental experience: the experience of encountering something that exceeds expectation. Exceeding expectation is unusual. Most things, if you have been told about them enough, meet your expectation at best. The pyramids, which have been described and reproduced and analyzed more than almost anything else in human history, still manage to exceed expectation in person. This is in itself a remarkable property. It suggests that whatever the pyramids are doing, they are doing it on a level that representation simply cannot reach. The pyramid form, as we have noted, is among the simplest of architectural shapes. And this simplicity may be part of what makes the actual presence of a real pyramid so different from the image of it. The image shows you a triangle, and a triangle is a thing the mind can quickly process and file. The actual pyramid is a triangle only at the level of overall form. At every other level of attention, it is something else entirely. It is an accumulation of individual stones, each one placed by human hands, each one a decision made by a specific person in a specific moment, 4,500 years ago. It is a mountain of those decisions, stacked in courses, rising to a point in the sky. And when you are standing at the base, close enough to touch the stone, what you are touching is the sum of those decisions, the physical residue of an enormous collective act of making. This is, when you really think about it, one of the most human things in the world. The pyramid is, at its most fundamental level, the result of people choosing to do something and then doing it, day after day, year after year, decade after decade. No single person could see the whole of what was being made. The workers who were cutting and moving stone in the early years of construction did not live to see the finished structure. The workers who put the capstone in place had not been born when the first courses were laid. The pyramid was built across generations by people who were working towards something they could only partially imagine, in service of a purpose that the state and the religion defined, but that each individual experienced in their own way. There is something about this intergenerational quality that resonates deeply. The cathedral builders of medieval Europe had a similar experience. Working on structures that took generations to complete, that no single person would see finished, that required a kind of faith in the project's continuation beyond any individual's lifetime. The great cathedrals and the great pyramids are different in almost every cultural and religious particular, but they share this quality of being too large for any single human life. They required people to contribute to something that their descendants would complete, or that had been started by their ancestors. This requires a kind of social trust and a kind of temporal reach that is itself moving. To believe in the continuation of a project past your own death, to commit your labor to something that you know you will not see finished, is an act of faith in the human collective that is not always easy to maintain. The fact that these structures were completed at all speaks to the depth of that faith in the societies that built them. Fascination without full resolution is not a failure. It is, in many cases, the honest and appropriate response to things that are genuinely complex and genuinely beyond any single perspective's capacity to exhaust. The pyramids have been the subject of countless complete and confident theories over the centuries. Each generation has tended to produce some version of the definitive account, the explanation that finally settles the question, that finally tells us what the pyramids really are and really mean. And each of these accounts has eventually given way to a more nuanced, more complex, more qualified understanding. The confidence was always slightly ahead of the evidence. The evidence, when it came, was always richer and stranger than the confident account had anticipated. This pattern is not unique to pyramid scholarship. It is the pattern of all genuine inquiry into genuinely complex subjects. The appropriate response is not to stop trying to understand. It is to hold the current understanding more lightly, to remain open to revision, to appreciate the partial view for what it is, without mistaking it for the whole. The pyramids are particularly good at enforcing this humility. They are too large and too old, and too embedded in a culture too different from ours, for any current account to be the final one. What we know today about the pyramids is more than any previous generation has known, and it is almost certainly less than future generations will know. The ongoing work of archaeologists at Giza and at pyramid sites throughout Egypt continues to produce new evidence. The application of new technologies, from satellite imaging to muon tomography to chemical analysis of construction materials, continues to yield new information. The refinement of our understanding of ancient Egyptian religion and society continues to provide new interpretive context. The pyramids are not a closed subject. They are an active field of inquiry, with real practitioners and real ongoing debates. And even when the scholarship has advanced much further than it has today, the pyramids will still be standing in the desert, and people will still be going to stand before them, and the experience will still be something that representation cannot fully prepare you for. Because the experience is not primarily about the information. The information matters, and knowing more is better than knowing less. But the experience is about the encounter between a human consciousness and something that exceeds its normal capacity to absorb. And that encounter does not become routine, no matter how much scholarship accumulates. The desert around Giza holds the pyramids the way a frame holds a painting, and the desert is itself part of the meaning. The desert is one of the most extreme environments on Earth. It is the environment of reduction and essence, of things stripped to their simplest and most durable form. Wood rots in a forest. Metal corrodes in a damp environment. Stone crumbles under the pressure of frost and rain. But in the desert, things can be preserved for extraordinary periods because the conditions for the usual processes of decay are absent. Dry air, minimal biological activity, stable temperatures. The desert is where things last. The ancient Egyptians understood this. Their civilization grew up in the Nile Valley, a narrow ribbon of green that owed everything to the river and was surrounded on both sides by the desert. The desert was not their home. It was the place of death, the red land, as opposed to the black land of the fertile valley. But it was also the place of preservation. The Egyptians buried their dead in the desert, not in the valley, because they knew that bodies kept longer there. The mummification process was an attempt to extend this natural preservation, to give the desert's gift of dryness to the body, regardless of where it was finally placed. The pyramids sit at the edge of this desert. They are positioned at the boundary between the cultivated land and the waste. They are neither fully in the world of the living, the Nile Valley with its crops and its villages and its people, nor fully in the world of the dead, the open desert. They occupy the threshold. And thresholds, in almost every culture, are places of particular significance. This threshold position was probably not accidental. The pyramid plateau at Giza was chosen with care. It is elevated, giving visibility across the valley. It is at the edge of the good limestone deposits that provided the building material. It is on the west bank, the traditional location for Egyptian burial, west being the direction of the setting sun, and therefore in Egyptian cosmology, the direction of death and the afterlife. Everything about the location speaks to a deliberate choice, a decision to place these structures at a specific point in the landscape that had specific meanings within the Egyptian symbolic geography. The landscape has changed enormously since the pyramids were built. The Nile itself has shifted. The water table has changed. The harbour and canal system that served the pyramid construction is long since silted in and covered. The workers' village is now an archaeological site. And Cairo, one of the most populous cities in Africa, has spread outward from its historic centre until its suburbs are visible from the pyramid plateau. What was desert around the pyramids when they were built is now, in some directions, approaching the edge of urbanization. The pyramids have watched all of this happen. They have been at the edge of cultivation when the edge was far away, and they are now at the edge of a megacity. This change in context changes something about how they feel when you visit. The full isolation of the desert experience, the sense of being entirely in an ancient landscape, is harder to achieve at Giza than it once was. The city is too close. The sound of traffic is audible at the wrong time of day. The horizon in some directions is urban. And yet the pyramids themselves remain what they are. The city pressing on their edges does not change what they are. Their scale is sufficient to hold their own against the visual noise of the surrounding development. When you look at the pyramid, you see the pyramid. The city is peripheral. It does not intrude into the center of the experience. This resilience of presence, the ability of the pyramids to remain visually and experientially dominant, even in conditions very different from those for which they were designed, is another expression of the formal power of the pyramid shape. It is a shape that holds its own. It is not subtle. It does not require specific context to work. It works in the desert, and it works on the outskirts of a megacity, and it works in a photograph taken from a tour bus, and it works at dawn, and at midday, and at night. The form is, within the range of conditions it has encountered, essentially invariant in its effect. There is something at the meeting point of scale, age, human achievement, and silence that produces a specific experience. It is an experience that different people describe in different terms. Some use religious or spiritual language. Some use aesthetic language. Some use simply the language of being impressed, of being stopped in their tracks by something. The specific vocabulary varies enormously, but the experience itself seems to be consistent enough across people and cultures that it functions as something like a shared response. What this shared response suggests is that the pyramids are accessing something that operates across cultural and individual variation, something closer to the level of basic human experience than to the level of culturally specific response. The same structures that moved a Greek traveller in the 5th century BCE move a Japanese tourist in the 21st century CE. The cultural frameworks are completely different. The languages are unrelated. The religious and philosophical contexts have nothing in common. And yet, both travellers come away from Giza having had a version of the same experience. The simplest explanation is probably the right one. The pyramids are extremely large and extremely old, and the product of extraordinary human effort. And these properties, at the extremes the pyramids represent, produce a response in human beings regardless of cultural context. Scale above a certain threshold produces awe. Age above a certain threshold produces a specific kind of temporal vertigo. Evidence of human effort at this magnitude produces something between admiration and disbelief. These are not culturally specific responses. They are responses that arise from the basic structure of human perception and cognition. The pyramids are, in this sense, addressed to something very fundamental in us. They are not speaking a specific cultural language. They are speaking in a more basic register, a register that most things we encounter in daily life don't access. This is why they work on people who know very little about Egypt and on people who have spent careers studying Egyptian history. The knowledge adds richness and specificity to the experience, but the basic experience is available to anyone with eyes and the capacity to be present to what they are seeing. Presence, again, is the key. We keep returning to this word because it keeps being the relevant concept. The pyramids are not primarily a text to be read or a problem to be solved. They are a presence to be encountered. And presence is something that happens between the object and the observer, in the space of actual encounter, in the particular moment and place when the two meet. This means that no account of the pyramids, however detailed, can substitute for the encounter. It can prepare for it, enrich it, frame it, but it cannot replace it. The encounter is irreducible. It has to happen in person, in the actual place, with the actual light and the actual air, and the actual sound, and the actual physical reality of 4,500 years of stone. This is part of why people continue to travel to Giza, despite having seen the images 1,000 times, despite knowing in advance roughly what they will find, despite the heat and the crowds and the cost and the effort. They are not going for the information, they are going for the encounter. They are going to have the experience that the images have been pointing toward but cannot deliver. And they continue to find, when they arrive, that the images had not prepared them. That the pyramid is more than the image. That the encounter is different from the knowledge. That something happens at Giza, in the presence of the actual stone, that could not have happened anywhere else. This is, in the end, what the pyramids are about, if they are about anything in particular. They are about the limits of representation. They are an argument, made in stone over 4,500 years, that some things can only be encountered directly, that some things resist reduction to image or word or data, that the real thing, in the real place, at the real scale, in the real time, is always more than its representation. We live in an era of unprecedented representational power. We can photograph and film and digitally model and virtually render almost anything. We can transmit these representations instantly to anyone, anywhere on Earth. And still, the pyramids are not exhausted by their representations. Still, people go to stand before them in person. Still, the experience exceeds the expectation every time. That is, perhaps, the most enduring thing the pyramids have to tell us. Not about ancient Egypt. Not about construction techniques or religious belief or the organization of labor, but about the nature of experience itself. About the irreducibility of the real. About the way that certain things, certain very large, very old, very carefully made things, retain a presence that cannot be captured and sent along, that must be met where it lives. The pyramid doesn't need anything from us. It has been standing through everything, and it will continue to stand through everything that comes next. It doesn't require our wonder, though our wonder seems to be what it reliably produces. It doesn't require our understanding, though it continues to reward the effort to understand. It doesn't require our presence, though our presence is what it makes most vivid. It simply stands there, at the edge of the desert, in the pale stone of the plateau, where the green of the Nile Valley ends and the emptiness begins. As it was this morning, as it will be tomorrow morning, as it has been for longer than we can genuinely feel, and as it will be for longer than we can reliably imagine. Thank you for being here tonight on ZzZscience. The pyramid is still standing.